When things go wrong, as they sometimes will, when the road you're trudging seems all uphill, when the funds are low and the debts are high, and you want to smile but you have to sigh, when care is pressing you down a bit, rest if you must, but do not ever quit. Success is a failure turned inside out. Let's talk and clear the clouds of doubt.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk. We're very glad to have you with us today. I'm your host, Omar Dunlap. Assalamu alaikum. And we have with us, as always, Brother Idris Tawfiq. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
And we have with us also as well our beautiful, very handsome, very well-dressed, very intelligent studio audience. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Today we're discussing the topic of Muslims in Europe, their relations with their non-Muslim neighbors, what are the implications of that on the Muslim Ummah, and other topics as well, inshaAllah. But before we get into that, I'd like to give just a few minutes for my favorite part of every episode, which is Brother Idris Tawfiq's Reflections. What do you have for us today, brother?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-mursaleen Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most compassionate, all praise be to Allah, the Lord of the worlds. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon His final messenger Muhammad, and may the peace and the blessings and the mercy of Allah be upon all of you who are watching this program today. As Brother Omar said, we're talking today in the show about Muslims in Europe. And reflecting on that, I thought about one of the most controversial things to happen recently in Europe, and that was this ban on minarets in Europe. So I reflected on the. We may talk about it later on in the show, but as with all things in Islam, if we reflect on all things that happen, it can touch our hearts and help us to be better people. When I lived in Alexandria, city on the north coast of Egypt, for the first time I realized how blessed I was as a Muslim. And it happens now, living all the time in the land of Islam, we have this blessing that we take for granted. I would be woken up by the sound of the adhan for Salat al-Fajr. In the distance in the city of Alex, you would hear Allahu Akbar. And then somewhere else in the distance you'd hear Allah, and then Allah, Allah, until the whole city burst out into praise of Allah. And mashallah, subhanallah, that's one of the most beautiful things of living in the land of Islam. Because 5 times a day we can hear from the minarets of our mosques that beautiful call, the most beautiful sound in all the world. Allahu Akbar, God is the most great. Now, I would suggest to you, brothers and sisters, the purpose of my thought here today is we're so lucky hearing that sound, Allahu Akbar, 5 times a day. There are communities in the world, Muslims, who never hear that. They never get the chance to hear Allahu Akbar from the mosque. Whilst we're in the mall, shopping in the mall, and the adhan sounds, and we say to one another, oh yeah, we've got time yet to pray, and we carry on with our shopping. We take for granted that most beautiful of sounds that Allah gives us. Now just a reflection on the adhan itself, on that most beautiful call to prayer, call to security, to real success in life. During the Second World War, there were buildings, certainly in the UK where I'm from, they were called air raid shelters. Because when the planes came to bomb the cities in the UK, the ordinary citizens could flee as quickly as they can. When the air raid siren sounded, the people would know the planes were coming, and they'd rush into the air raid sirens for safety. Now it seems to me, when the adhan sounds, the adhan is calling us not to take refuge from bombs falling from the sky, but the adhan is calling us 5 times a day to take refuge in Allah. to leave the cares and the troubles of this world behind just for a few moments and to go to the mosque and to pray. In Cairo here, there's a beautiful mosque, one of my favorites. It's called the Mosque of Ahmed ibn Tulun. Really very, very beautiful mosque. And you enter the mosque, there's a great big wall around the whole mosque, and you go in through one of the gates to find that you're not yet in the mosque itself. There's sort of an enclosure and then another wall. So you walk a little bit further and go through the second gate into the mosque itself. And the purpose of these two walls was that in olden times when the mosque was built, outside the main gate was the hustle and the bustle of life. Market traders selling their wares, donkeys, pigeons, camels, all sorts of noise going on outside. So you'd go in through the first gate, and there was that little space just to take you from the hustle and bustle of life outside the mosque, through a little space into the next entrance into the mosque itself, so that you could leave behind. Islam is not, there's no distinction in Islam between religion and life. Islam is a way of life. It's not a going to church on a Sunday religion. It affects everything we do. But just for those short few moments each day, we leave aside the cares of this world. It's not an escape from reality. Going into the mosque to pray is an escape to reality. And it puts in perspective all that we've been doing during the day. And we go and we, before Allah, when our foreheads touch the ground in prayer, we bring all of those things outside the wall of the mosque. We bring them to Allah. But instead of burdening us and pulling us down and giving us cares and worries, when we're in the presence of Allah, all of those burdens and troubles we hand to Him and say, Allah, you made the heavens and the earth and everything in between. You know every leaf that falls from every tree. I hand all of these things over to you. I am your servant, your slave. Do with me as you will. So I would invite you, brothers and sisters, today we're thinking about Muslims in Europe. And we're speaking to Muslims in Europe now. You know some of the difficulties you face, and you know some of the great advantages you have living in the West, living in Europe. But I would invite all Muslims, just in this little reflection at the start of the show, to realize what a gift the Adhan is for all of us. And to examine each of our hearts today and ask, do we take that most beautiful of sounds for granted when in the morning we hear Allahu Akbar? Do we turn over and go back to sleep? Or do we say, as the pilgrims say for the Hajj, Labaik Allahumma labaik. Here I am, O Allah. Here I am to do your will. So that's my thought for today, brother.
MashaAllah. As always, very thought-provoking, and it's a privilege for us to be able to sit and listen to your reflections. We're going to take a short break right now, and when we come back, inshallah, we'll take a look at some questions that we've asked our viewers about certain issues involving Muslims in Europe, and inshallah we'll have a discussion about that, so don't go away. The show's just beginning, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Earth, the human heart, greed, exploitation, hatred, all diseases of the heart. For the cure, join Huda TV every Sunday at 20 GMT for Moments for the Heart.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to our show, Let's Talk. In this segment, we're going to look at some questions that we've asked to some random people on the street because our show topic today is Muslims in Europe. And one of the things that we were curious about is we want to ask them why do they think that the Swiss vote to ban the minaret is such a big deal. And also that, what was the other question, Brother Idris? Do you happen to...
Why did they ban the minarets? And also, why is it a big deal anyway that they should ban them?
Right, why do you think they banned them and why is it a big deal? So we're going to look at the answers to their questions, inshallah.
The minarets are very important for Muslims because we have to build one of them with each mosque, because one of Muslims have to climb up on minaret and to invite others on prayer.
Banning minarets in Switzerland, you could say it's a big thing because it represents the biggest problem that actually exists in Europe, and that is some type of Islamophobia, which is present in the most parts of the West, especially contributed with the happenings which happened in the world in the last some 5 or so years, which actually even brought Islamophobia to a bigger level that, as we can see, can be represented as the banning of an object which is actually a milestone in Islam, and it is the symbol of Islam, and that's why they want to ban it, because they think with the symbol of Islam being represented in the West, the country would seem like an Islamic country.
They did it probably because they don't know enough about Islam and they are afraid from Islam. But I have to invite those people to read and to learn about Islam, because we are peaceful religion and we like others and we want to live with others like normal people.
Swiss people, as any other people in the West, definitely felt that with banning the minaret, they would actually stop Islam in the country. That the Islam would disappear with not presence of an object. That is gradually present in most European countries in which they are building first mosques as they are present. And that is my opinion, that is just the Islamophobia with right representation and explanations. The people would vote it differently. But with the information they have now, they voted as they did.
MashaAllah, that was a very interesting analysis on behalf of those people. What are your thoughts on what you just heard?
Bismillah. Well, the brothers certainly have some very forceful ideas on why.
Right.
They seem quite clear as to why. The fact is that in Switzerland, you know, on, I think, was it the 27th of November, the 29th, something like that, 57.5% of the Swiss population voted in favour of a referendum to ban the construction of new minarets in Switzerland. Now, in Switzerland at the moment, there are 4 minarets. There are 4. And there are 150 mosques or prayer rooms. So you'd wonder to yourself why it was such a big deal to ban them in the first place. Now, before we say anything more, and before the audience have any questions, I'm going to ask you, brothers, can you give some suggestions why did the ordinary people of Switzerland vote to ban the building of minarets? What do you think? Just what's your immediate thought to that? There's no right or wrong answer. Why?
I know you have a thought. You do, don't you?
Indeed, but just to picture that act and that incident in the very outset, just to ask you one question. I agree with me that the factual act that says Islam is the fastest growing religion and the religion of the century. Are you agree with me in that fact or not?
Okay, so you've answered my question with a question. Is Islam the fastest growing? Well, we think it is. We think it is. Let's set your question aside just for the moment, brother.
Okay.
Because it's important. I think it's important to what we're talking about. And it's important to do with people's fears of Islam in Europe. But why do you think, give me just a thought on why ordinary people, maybe they've never met a Muslim in their lives in Switzerland, why can it be that ordinary people in such large numbers would vote, and what it was a vote against Islam, really. Why would they choose to vote against Islam? Just what comes to your mind when you hear that idea?
Indeed, they are the victims. They are the victims of media and what they are saying about Islam in the very unhumble way. They are speaking about Islam as the religion of oppression and the religion of malpractice and so on of that very vice matters. And also, just to start from the outset, and the outset say that they have the strategy, and the strategy say that once they have an image of advance of Islam in Europe and in a country, once they are seeing that advance, they are start a new mission of like the minarets and like the cartoons of Danish citizens. Okay.
So he's saying that the people there are victims.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. That the ordinary citizens of Switzerland are victims of the media. But an interesting thing is, as Muslims, I just throw an idea out just to be provocative. I think for too long we've seen ourselves as victims. As soon as the minaret thing started, as soon as the referendum had been passed, we had demonstrations and we had all sorts of stuff against it, and some people, important people, described what the Swiss had done as a very insult to Muslims throughout the world. But I think it's partly because of what you say, Al-Barat. People in Switzerland and countries in Europe, these ideas haven't just fallen out of the sky, that Islam is some kind of threat to them. The idea didn't just pop up from nowhere. This idea has been growing over many years, that Islam is a threat. For better or worse, that's the idea many people have got. Nearly 60% of the population don't vote against Islam if they think it's a blessing for their country.
Right.
So there are so many questions. When our guest comes, we'll be talking to him about this too. But there are so many questions about what have we done, to give the correct image of Islam. It's no good putting they think this and they do this. But if we're the only Muslims they see, maybe some of the blame goes on us to start. What sort of example have they given us of Islam, not just in Switzerland, but in any country?
Well, I don't deny that. That's certainly accurate. Are we living as Muslims? But another question would be, like, for example, it's a very common complaint you hear from the non-Muslims. They say, well, if Muslims, by and large, don't support terrorism, why aren't there more of them speaking out? While I feel like a lot of Muslims are speaking out, but I think the question is, are you listening?
Yes.
Are you willing to give us an open forum to discuss these issues? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, what you say is very true, brother. But also, you see, you come from that background, and I come from that background. So I always think to myself, what must my friends be thinking? Let's always try and see ourselves as other people see us. I think this is very important. It's true what you say. People say to us, why don't Muslims speak out against terrorism? And we reply, but we do, but it just isn't getting...
Right.
It isn't making headlines.
Right.
A bomb going off is better headlines than a sweet man saying we condemn violence.
Right.
So that's one of the problems. And another of the problems is that we're just not giving the chance for the right message to come through. This is a problem too. Maybe we ask the audience if you have any questions before we carry on.
Maybe we could address his question about is Islam the fastest growing religion in the world? and then we'll...
Okay, well, I don't know. Is it a fact that it is?
I don't know.
It's a dispute. It's a disputed fact. It's a
yeah.
claim that we make
Right,
that
yeah.
Islam is the fastest growing religion in the
Well,
world.
I saw on a Christian, it was a Christian program called the John Ankerberg Show, and this show is very famous for having a very negative opinion of Islam. But they said on this show, and of course we can quote this because they have no reason to fabricate anything. They don't, they're against us. We'll say, quote unquote, and they said that 20,000 people a year convert to Islam in America. If I'm not mistaken, of course we'll have to verify that. And they said that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. Now this is what they said. Again, this would all need to be verified, but you have this from a lot of different sources. I believe CBS News said that, but you have also critics. You
see, the question is then, if it is that, why is it a threat?
Right.
Why would that be considered by people to be a threat?
Right.
Islam is a religion of peace. The Muslims I know are good, honest, hard-working men and women. So why would ordinary folk in Main Street, as they say, why would they be frightened?
I think they're afraid that Muslims have a secret agenda, that we have an agenda to enact Sharia. We're going to force it on everybody. We're going to start cutting your hands off and stoning people and this sort of thing. I think is what they're afraid of. Of course, that's not true, but
let's see what Ahmed has to say.
So what do we have for?
I think that most of people in the West read well about Islam and try to understand its laws and its principles, but for sorry, we suffer from misunderstanding of them towards Islam. And I think that there is a wide gap between Muslim and non-Muslim in the West. I don't think that the conflict is due to only the Islam. I think it is maybe to another reason, maybe for the land, maybe to the being of the Muslims themselves. I think this is the main reason. It is not about Islam or about religion. For example, they talking about freedom in everything. Just about religion, no freedom. Everyone allowed to do anything, but they stop only at the point of the religion. This is my opinion.
That's
I want you to comment about this.
It's a very good idea what you're saying, brother. It's very true. That the misunderstanding is baseless. What you say, though, is the majority of people, they're reasonably open-minded about things in Europe and so on. So if they're open-minded, how do they end up? How do we end up with a fight? We always seem to end up in a fight. Before the referendum in Switzerland, I wrote an article in one of the newspapers here, and it was about a mosque in Fayoum city in Egypt, Mosque of Kite Bay in Fayoum city. And the mosque is about 600 years old. It's never had a minaret. It's never had one. And minarets, of course, they're not essential to a mosque. It's not a required feature of a mosque. The idea of the minaret, as one of the Vox Pop said, it was to enable people long ago to be able to call people to prayer. And it's become, over the centuries, associated with Islam and kind of a symbol. He called it a symbol of Islam. But it's not an essential part of Islam.
Right.
For us to pray, we simply have to find a clean place on the ground to pray.
Right.
So before the referendum, I was asking the question, we ought to be careful here if we're fighting over something that's not all that important to fight about.
Pick your battles.
Pick your battles very carefully. But then the problem is, when the referendum took place against Islam, it turns into something else. It moves away from minarets altogether, and it becomes a question of, but why Muslims can't do it? Why this group can build their towers, and this group can build theirs, but Muslims can't build theirs. And that's what follows on from your question, Ahmed. Maybe there's some sort of sinister agenda that's been raised by these people who wanted the referendum in the first place. Because there are groups in Europe, right-wing groups, that are rife at the moment, that are pointing fingers at foreigners. And of course many Muslims in Europe don't hail from Europe to start with. So Islam in that sense is seen as something foreign and alien to their country, to their culture. And unfortunately they drove us, as ever, they drove us into a corner fighting about something that we didn't need to fight about. And I've said it on this show a number of times, when we point a finger once at someone, 3 fingers point back at us. And if I point at you, 3 fingers are pointing back at me. So when I ask a question of someone else, I must ask myself the same question. And so I would just invite us to think, what have I done? What's the reason that these people are so suspicious of Islam? How is it that I haven't been able, by my words and by my example, to convince them otherwise? Now, maybe from what both of the brothers have said, it's because the media and those who control it, and these groups who have very other agendas, maybe they're so powerful, and as you say, brother, our correct image of Islam isn't getting through. Maybe all of these are building up together, and the true image of Islam, as Ahmed is saying, from ordinary folk is, well, it's okay, it's fine. But these people are just being led, to be suspicious and afraid. The poster they had, did you see the poster they used for the minaret? It showed a woman in black, and it showed minarets in black. And they looked like rockets, missiles, actually. Yeah. They looked like missiles, not minarets. And it was clear, it was frightening.
Right.
The poster was white, black, and red, which, by the way, are the old colours of Nazism. Very frightening poster. And people seeing that on the TV and down the street and outside their church and outside their school all the time, it would frighten children.
And it will have a psychological effect, maybe small.
That's right.
But it will have an effect.
Right.
That will be in your mind forever.
And if that's all they're seeing of Muslims, because if Muslims are just quietly going to pray in their mosque, they're not going to go on the way to the mosque, they're not going to be shouting down the street, Islam is beautiful.
Right.
So they do it very quietly. If the only image people are seeing is this frightening image, maybe we've got problems.
I was thinking too, like, why the minaret? This is something that I was thinking. There's all kinds of things you could ban if you just want to be provocative. You could ban a mosque, building new mosques, Tell people to pray in a converted department store, but you can't build it. Why not? And then I was thinking, the minaret is something beautiful. It's a beautiful piece of Islamic architecture that's related to our religion. And since we were talking about a sinister agenda from some small elements of certain societies, I was thinking that this could possibly be an effort to disassociate Islam with any form of beauty. We don't want people thinking about beautiful architecture when they see a mosque. We want them thinking of missiles. So we make the minaret look like a missile, and we have a vote telling people they can't have a minaret and this sort of thing. What do you think about that theory?
Again, no, excellent idea. I think there are two challenges. My first thought is minarets are beautiful, but Muslims should be more beautiful.
Well, this is true.
Muslims should be so beautiful that the people of Switzerland and any country should say, look, they are Muslims. They're good, honest people, they're kind, they're religious people, they pray, they respect and honour their parents and their children, they hold women in the highest regard, they're people of peace. This is what we should be telling them as Muslims.
By the way, I want to tell you something, since this seems to be your favorite topic about how the Muslims should be beautiful. I'm very proud of
Muslims are beautiful.
Of course, alhamdulillah. And I'm very proud of my Muslim community where I come from in America. It's a very small mosque of 100 people. And we had a Christian pastor from the Church of Christ denomination come to us and say, I want to go to a Muslim dentist. I have a problem with my teeth. He came to our mosque and said this, and we were like, why? And he said, because I know that Muslims are honest. They're honest people. He won't charge me extra. So he came to us. And I thought that this was very nice, that we're this small community of 100 people. So there is an element of, we don't want to say that all Muslims are not doing their job. There's a lot of us that are
and of course the second thought from what you say, brother, about the beauty of Islam, because Islam, the externals are very beautiful. And as Muslims we should be very wise in using our architecture, the way we present ourselves to other people, in a way that appeals to them.
Right.
We can play them at their own game, I might say, and give them, the people of Switzerland have a wonderful chance now, because everyone is talking about Islam. What a fantastic opportunity. Instead of looking upon it as a bad thing, that's a great thing.
Exactly.
Everyone's talking about Islam. Well, now it's time. We've plenty of money in the Muslim world.
Of course.
You and I mightn't have it, but there's plenty of money for Muslims to spend on the most beautiful mosque. Why don't some of our brothers in the Gulf, in the Arabian Peninsula, donate to build the most beautiful, beautiful mosque? It wouldn't have a minaret, But the people of Switzerland would look at it and say, wow, this enriches our nation. This is a blessing to our capital city.
MashaAllah. It's a great idea.
That's my challenge.
Well, that's our time is out just for this segment. But inshallah, we'll be back in just a few minutes, so don't go away, and we'll have a very special guest with us in the studio. So stay with us. We'll be right back, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
The true life of the Muslim starts at death. If you wish to enhance your knowledge of the Islamic perspective on the hereafter, this life doesn't go on forever, but we do so little to prepare for it because most of us don't know what happens after this life ends. If you want to be amongst those who know, then join us every Saturday at 1930 GMT for the inevitable journey.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to our show, Let's Talk. We're discussing the issue of Muslims in the West. Brother Idris, would you care to introduce our very special guest we have with us today?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would be delighted to introduce Dr. Hisham Helia. Hisham, it is, 3 years since we last met?
Yeah.
I'm honored that you've come to join us on the show. Dr. Hisham Helia is a fellow at Warwick University, and his speciality of research is Muslims in Europe. He's just written a book, Edinburgh University Press, is that right?
That's correct.
The book is called Muslims of Europe, and it can be found in all good bookshops.
I hope so.
Inshallah. So we're delighted that Dr. Hisham has come along today, and we're just today, I don't know if you've heard other parts of the program, we're talking about Muslims in Europe. Now, Muslims in Europe is like a trifle. There are that many Muslims in different countries, and the flavors are so different. What would be your opening shot on Muslims in Europe, the Muslims of Europe? What would be your opening, if you were telling Muslims in the world, in Australia, America, what would be your initial thought to share with them?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because if we look at how the media currently views the population of Muslims in Europe, the Muslim presence, as many of us now put it, there's a lot of pessimism, there's a lot of worry, there's a lot of anxiety about how these populations are developing. And I find that very interesting, because I actually see it in a much more positive fashion.
Can I interrupt before you continue? Pessimism from the Muslim community or from the non-Muslim community?
Well, generally I'm talking from the perspective of the mainstream media,
okay.
Which would generally be dominated by the non-Muslim community, obviously. And the worries have been twofold. First, security issues, as to whether or not Muslims of Europe are going to turn out to be an internal security threat, and we saw that a lot after the 7th of July bombings and the Madrid bombings and so forth. But more and more, there's been much more of a concern about cultural destruction, and that's been very, very pronounced, particularly over the last 2 to 3 years, where the Muslim presence is actually causing a lot of non-Muslims in Europe to worry about the sustainment and the continuation of Western civilization in Europe. Because these Muslim populations are growing in number, they're growing in influence as well, and I think a lot of people are very worried about that, and that causes a lot of anxiety and concern. And you see some of that in the recent minarets ban that took place in Switzerland. You see it in how different countries have banned or prescribed the hijab in certain areas, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of worry as to what this all means. So there are quite a few reasons for us to be concerned about how this trend is developing, because if you compare how the mainstream media has been talking about Muslim Europeans over the last few years to how the mainstream media talked about Jewish communities in the early parts of the 20th century, particularly in the 1920s, you see some very disturbing parallels. And I'm not saying that we're headed towards another Holocaust, but it just shows that there can be periods in European history where that sort of trend can develop very badly. On the Muslim side, I have quite a bit of optimism, because I see that Muslim populations have been moving towards this idea of indigenizing themselves within the European context, completely independently of the mainstream or any
Just
pressures.
explain what you mean by that, so
Of
people
course,
understand what you mean.
Because you, as I'm sure you're aware, Idris, the overwhelming majority of Muslims in Europe are originally not from Europe. The overwhelming majority are of immigrant extraction and recent immigrant extraction. So if you look back, say 50 years, at Western Europe, not so much in Southern Europe or in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe in particular, there would be very, very small numbers of Muslims. Many of them would be converts like yourself. But over the past 50 years, we've seen a huge amount of people arrive from different parts of the Muslim world, and they have benefited European society a great deal. But they arrived at a time when Europe really needed them to come to fill certain labor shortages, and it's taken them quite some time to acclimatize to the European context. For a very long time, most European Muslims didn't think they were going to stay in Europe. They thought that they were going to return home. There's a famous book written by Muhammad Anwar at Warwick University called The Myth of Return, where he talks about how Pakistani Muslims in the UK thought for well over a generation they were going to return home. This idea of return has completely disappeared off the face of the map now, and we now see second, third generation Muslims living in the UK, living
So they're
in France.
stuck there. They can't return. They're stuck there.
Oh, it's not about being stuck. They've made a conscious decision. We have no
Because this is
intention.
very different.
This is very different. Because the first generation, maybe some of them felt we're a bit stuck. We can't really go back, or so on and so forth. But the second, the third, and the fourth generation, they wouldn't view any other place as home. So it's not really returning back to anywhere, because they're already back to where they're from. They're back to the UK, they're back to France, they're back to Germany, they're back to all these countries.
So just let's come in there. Is the problem, I'll cut to the chase, and I'll say it because my face is white. In Britain, they ask Muslims the question, are you British or are you Muslim? They don't ask me that. No one would dare to ask me that. Is the problem, is the perceived threat of large numbers of Turks in Switzerland, large numbers of Algerians in France, large numbers of Bosnians in Italy, or is the threat Islam? What are they threatened by?
It's not as easy an answer as I can hope to give you, because in different countries the issues are different. There is an overall sort of European trend towards viewing the Muslim presence as problematic, but problematic in different ways. So, for instance, you would never have the minarets ban in the UK, but you could have it in Switzerland. And it's very surprising that it happened in Switzerland, because the Swiss Muslim population are not particularly socially or politically active. Nothing in comparison to France or the UK, for that matter. They weren't at all controversial, but it was in Switzerland for reasons that had less to do actually with Islam or even the Muslims that this whole minarets ban came about. Within other countries, race definitely does have a role to play, and I think that's very important to just sort of come out and say, because Europe generally, historically speaking, has not had a very good track record when it comes to race. But it's less now, I think, about simply race as it is about the fear that these different cultures in Europe are not going to be able to survive past through this phase of modernity. And that again is something that really has very little to do with the Muslim presence, as it has to do with things like European integration, as it has to do with globalization, as it has to do with the way that European societies have developed in the past 30, 40 years. Muslims then come into that picture as perhaps the most vivid example of how things have changed. So if you go to a place like Leicester, for example, in England, Leicester 50 years ago was completely white. You couldn't really see a non-white face around. Now Leicester is almost half Asian in terms of its the extraction of its citizens. And this is very natural, and it's not something that happened overnight. But as far as British people are concerned, thinking back over several hundred years, this did happen overnight. And you only see this in the 20th and 21st centuries, where huge numbers of populations have changed quite drastically. So I wouldn't say that it's purely Islam or purely race. I think all of these things sort of overplay with each other, and also from the Muslims' perspective as well, because you will have Muslim populations in different parts of Europe making demands on the mainstream population, which they will then claim is part of their religious sort of duty, but it may have very little to do with their religious duty as it does with their sense of maintaining their cultural identity. So it can get very complicated.
And well, let me pick a country so we don't have people writing in emails, because let's pick, I don't know, Mauritania. I don't know how many Mauritanians there are in the UK, but let's think of second generation Mauritanians growing up in the UK, and because you're talking about a problem about modernity. These youngsters growing up, I remember hearing Tariq Ramadan in Canada, and he was speaking to the ISNA conference in Canada, and he said that the conference was called Shaping a Canadian Muslim Identity. And he said to the people in the audience, your kids have no problem about being Canadian and Muslim. Because they're Canadian, they speak with Canadian accents. This is what they've grown up as. So isn't the problem that these youngsters, they're losing their ethnic background? That maybe is going. That cultural thing is going, because it doesn't match with the kind of modern lifestyle they live. But where does Islam fit into that?
Again, I think it depends on who you're talking about, because on the one hand, there will be, especially from the earlier generations, there will be people who will try to maintain their Islam with their cultural identity from their home countries for quite some time. But that really dies out after the second generation, except past a certain symbolic sort of notion of it. So you'll still see second or third generation British citizens whose great-grandparents or grandparents came from Pakistan, and they may still feel the need to wave the flag when there's a Pakistani football game going on. But past that sort of symbolism, you won't really see very much. And I think that, by and large, Muslims in the United Kingdom have definitely made it very plain and obvious, both to themselves as to the mainstream community, that they don't want to see a Pakistani Islam in the UK. They want to see Islam for a British context, because they are British and they are Muslims, and they don't see any contradiction between the two. And it's been very interesting this past year, because we've seen different polls taking place and different research studies done, which show, particularly with regards to the UK, that British Muslims are probably more patriotic than the average non-Muslim in terms of the sense of feeling that they belong within the United Kingdom. And the UK is different in this regard compared to other European countries, I have to say.
Did they have another poll asking how Muslim they are?
No.
I think that would be an interesting poll. I tell you why, because, I used to be Roman Catholic. And in the UK, at the beginning of the 20th century, great immigration from Ireland. Irish Catholics came to the UK looking for a better life. And they came and they were an oppressed minority, that's a fact. And so what they did was they emphasized education, and they built Catholic schools, and they saved and worked very hard to build these schools so that Catholics could eventually be educated well and enter the professions and become part of the educated middle class. But the problem is that what happened was that these people, many of them, eventually they became more British than the Queen. And the reason that the schools had existed in the first place, to preserve their Catholic identity, it was lost. So, I always, Hisham, I always have a little bit of a smile on my face when these polls are mentioned and surveys are taken, and it shows that the people are, they're very patriotic and they feel very British. And I ask myself, at what cost? Where has Islam gone?
Well, that's an interesting question. But with regards to British Muslims living in the 21st century, you see quite an outbreak, actually, of different organizations coming up. You see the ones who are most interested in maintaining a British identity, culturally and socially speaking. You see the people who are most interested in that actually being some of the most religious as well. So you do have different phenomena. You do have people who, I'm sure, as you have in any society where immigrants have come and they're trying to integrate and so forth, there are different choices that people have. And one of those, such an utter assimilationist standpoint, if I can use that word, then obviously they will try their hardest to merge into the pre-existing hegemonic culture, even with regards to religion. And I think we have to expect that. I think that that's something that we just take as granted. But you do have other people who maintain their religious identity very, very strongly, and they try to find a cultural identity through their religion. And that's very strong. I see that all across the United Kingdom.
I don't know how much time we've got, but there's a question I really do want to ask, because you hear people talking about it, because it makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck when I hear people talk about British Muslims. You know? No one talks about Algerian Muslims. They don't talk about Yemeni Muslims or Egyptian Muslims, but they talk about French Muslims and Swedish Muslims. Is there such a thing as a European Muslim?
Well, here we go into something I actually do in my book.
Ah, there we are. There's the book to read. Muslims of Europe.
Looking at some of the way that we describe different people, right? I prefer in my book to use the expression Muslim Britons as opposed to British Muslims, because using the phrase British Muslims, for me, actually hints at the idea that they're not really at home where they are, which I don't think is accurate. But then not everybody uses that appellation in the same way, and you could very well have people talking about Muslim Europeans as aliens within Europe. But I choose to use that sort of expression, and I don't even use the phrase Muslims in Europe anymore. I prefer to use words like the Muslim presence or Muslims of Europe, just to re-emphasize that sort of connection. But in terms of a European Muslim, I think you'd have to ask exactly the same question with regards to a European non-Muslim, because all of these identities they overlap quite a lot. So I may feel very European, but my understanding of what that means is very different than to what you might or what any other person living in Europe does. And these are all different identities. I mean, the identity of Muslim isn't an identity. It's a religious commitment. And this is something very important that I think a lot of Muslims have forgotten, that Islam is not an identity. Islam is a religion. And that's very, very different. Identities are, it can be social, they can be economic, they can be political, they can even be religious, but Islam is something completely different. So when people say, are you British or are you Muslim, as I see a lot of people being asked within the United Kingdom, I always think, those are two completely different questions. Are you British is a completely different context than are you a Muslim? And the two may not contradict, but they also may not actually meet, because then they're on completely different planes of existence.
To me, it's like asking a man, are you a husband or a father?
Yeah, it's that sort of thing. It's not I find the question to be incorrect from the get-go. And I'm quite pleased to see that we've stopped asking that particular question within the United Kingdom recently. But you also have a great many fears from people within the United Kingdom wondering, are these Muslims who reside within our midst, are they really here just as we are, as just British people, or are they here to try to change the United Kingdom from the inside, and there's some sort of fifth element? That's a very worrying sort of development, even more worrying from my perspective than the security debate, because security-wise, nobody has ever said that Muslims in the United Kingdom are, on a whole, a security risk. They say minorities are. Even the most extreme of radicals within the United Kingdom would say that. But with regards to the cultural destruction idea, there the paintbrush is rather wide.
All right, well, I think we're going to take a quick break. Let me just stop you right there. When we come back, we'll take some questions from our audience, and inshallah, we'll get into our emails. So don't go away. We'll be right back, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
So this is an open invitation for everybody to recognize God and enjoy His blessings in this life and His mercy in this life and in the hereafter as well. Allah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. Each name has a meaning. Each name signifies a nature of Allah the Almighty which no one shares or is compared to Allah in it.
العرش العظيم لا إله إلا الله رب العرش الكريم لا إله إلا الله رب العرش العظيم لا إله إلا الله رب العرش الكريم.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to this wonderful episode of Let's Talk. I'm your moderator, Omar Dunlap, and we have with us Brother Idris, and of course we have with us our very special guest who I hope you've been watching because he's really shed a lot of light on Muslims in Europe. It's been very, very fantastic. But for right now, we're going to go to our studio audience and ask them if they have any questions for our guests. Yes, go ahead, brother.
Dr. Hisham, could you tell us more about how can Islam grow in a place where there is an increase in of people who don't care about Islam, about religion, about spiritual at all?
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you realize that Europe is actually a place where people don't care about religion, because this is a problem that I see in how people in the Arab world actually look at how Muslims in Europe are actually exist, and they wonder, why do Europeans, for example, not understand why Muslims were so upset with the Danish cartoons, for example? Surely they would be upset at cartoons making fun or mocking Jesus. And this is a great sort of gap of misunderstanding, because the reality is that Europe is a post-religious continent. And this is something that also Muslims within the European context also had to get to grips with, that people in Europe don't really care about religion in the same way that religion is cared about within the Arab world, or within South America, or within Africa, or within great swathes of this planet. And it's very difficult, I think, for Muslims to actually get to grips with that in the modern age. I think there are a lot of benefits in that struggle, however, because modernity is predominantly a secular sort of civilization, and modernity isn't something that Muslims in the UK just have to deal with. Modernity is also something that Muslims in Egypt have to deal with, and they have to understand, and they have to get to grips with, in order for them to actually communicate to the outside world. That's just the nature of world civilization at the moment. You do find Muslims coming up with very imaginative and inventive ways to maintain their religion and their commitment to their religion, whether it's in schools and education or in organizations, even in a secular society. And I do think there are some benefits to that, because secularism, if nothing else, means that you have to be very serious about what you're talking about. You have to be very committed to your religion. You can't simply leave it as something to be given, right? You actually have to make an effort for it. And that in itself, I think, is quite positive. So in answer to your question, I think if people want to be religious in Europe, they're very free to do so. Especially, I'd have to say, in the United Kingdom, just by the nature of British society and the British legal establishment. But they also have freedom to do anything else that they want as well. And we have to recognize that as a staple of how they have created their societies. And we have to understand that and be prepared to make the extra effort. And if we do, then I think you'll find that things are very easy.
MashaAllah.
Inshallah.
Good
Inshallah.
answer.
We need longer time. The show isn't long enough.
We really do. We need a 2-hour show or a 3-hour show. I would watch it. I don't know if everybody else would. Well, I want to go to our emails now. We have an email from Brother Ibrahim Mansour. He's one of our viewers here in Egypt. And he says that he was present at one of your public talks where someone actually declared the Shahada. And he wants to know, what does it feel like when that happens, both for you, and if you could shed some light on also how it feels for the people in the audience that witness that sort of thing.
How many hours do we have to answer this question?
None. Just a few minutes.
It's very important to remember that it is Allah Almighty who calls people to Islam. This is the mistake that many people make, and they fall into the trap and sometimes begin to believe their own publicity and think that somehow it's because of what they're saying that people are coming to Islam. That's the sure road to it all falling apart. You know, we remember when our heads touch the ground in prayer that we're nothing before Allah, and He just uses maybe a word we say. Inshallah, you know, in the show, some little thought or a word that could be said will be something that brings someone to Islam. I did a program here with Huda TV once, and we were waiting around a long time for the program to start. Not that that happens very often, but we waited a long time. And you know, the person who touched me most, it was the boy who was cleaning the floor. Because there were many important people talking about all sorts of stuff, but this little lad, you know, he was telling me how it was a good job for him, and he was supporting his mum and dad with the money he got. It was good money, and he really was a good example to me. So when someone, alhamdulillah, people do declare Shahada, it is the most humbling thing to think that Allah Almighty from the beginning of time chose to call that person on this day. But it also carries with it a responsibility, because those people, you feel as though you have some responsibility for them and have to follow them up on how are you and how is your Islam, because otherwise 2 weeks later, when they stop praying and stop calling themselves Muslim, you know, on Judgment Day we will be called to account, and Allah Almighty will say to us, where are those people that you got to become Muslim? You know, you tricked them to declare Shahada. Where are they now? Why didn't you look after them? Audiences, they're crying and they're full of happiness. Muslims love people to become Muslim. So I think the most important thing, it's very humbling to talk about Islam. We were talking before the program, what kind of a job have we got? All our job is we talk about Islam.
MashaAllah.
What a beautiful job.
Right.
And when people then, as a result of, you know, a little phrase that might be said, their life is turned upside down and they embrace Islam, it's truly wonderful. But the most important thing of all is that it is Allah who calls to Islam.
And we have to keep that in mind. And
we have to keep
ourselves humble, inshallah.
And we also have to keep in mind the email address, talk, you always forget, talk at huda.tv. So
I'll remember it next time, inshallah. Talk at huda.tv, inshallah. I want to thank you, Brother Idris, as always, for being here with us. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Hisham. Thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
And I want to thank our studio audience. Jazakallah khair to everybody. And we hope to see you next time, inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
When things go wrong, as they sometimes will, when the road you're trudging seems all uphill, when things go wrong, as they sometimes will, when the road you're trudging seems all uphill, when the funds are low and the debts are high, and you want to smile but you have to sigh, when care is pressing you down a bit, rest if you must, but do not ever quit. Success is a failure turned inside out. Let's talk and clear the clouds of doubt. Success is a failure turned inside out. Let's talk and clear the clouds